So, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much again to Rabbi Dr. Wiener. Just as a very short introduction, because Tov Shem Shemen Tov and Gadol Meravan Shmo, and you'll hear his words, and he will not need any introduction. But just that you know, Rabbi Dr. Wiener is Musmach of YU and a graduate of Columbia and Columbia University, Harvard Medical School, is a psychiatrist, and also gives Torah shiurim in various capacities wherever he's been living. Originally from Los Angeles, but now we are very lucky to have him here in Eretz Israel for a few years now. Has it been 2 or 3 years? You are on mute, so sorry.
I was saying it's hard to believe that it's actually been just a little over 1.
Oh, wow. Yes, so it is hard to believe. Yes, so we're still, the luck is still very fresh. So thank you for being with us today, and I'm very grateful for you for agreeing to be with us, and looking forward to hear your shiur. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rav Atlas, and thank you all for having me. It's really a tremendous zechus and an honor to be able to learn Torah together anytime, but especially at a time like this where we're seeing so much darkness in the world. And you know that Chazal tell us the ultimate way to bring light into this world is through Oraisa, right? The source of light, the Torah. And you know that the war that we're fighting is not just a physical war, but just as much a spiritual war. And I pray that our learning together should be a merit for the Chayalim, for the Shvuyim, for all of us to enjoy Shalom very speedily. I was asked by Rabbi Atlas to speak about something related to the Daf Yomi, something that could connect to one of the sugyas, a number of the sugyas. And I figured since we're just beginning Maseches Bava Kama, it might be appropriate to have a little bit of an introduction to the concept of Bava Kama, specifically the types of payments that occur throughout Maseches Bava Kama and beyond, in Bava Metzia, Bava Basra, and the like. I don't know if you already had a shiur on Bava Kama last week or not, but if this is repetitive, just let me know and we'll switch gears maybe a little bit.
No, we didn't. The last shiur was still Kiddushin. So
okay.
we're
okay, I
fresh.
or finishing. Okay, great. So we know that every chelik of Torah is precious. Every chelik of Torah connects us to the wisdom of Hashem. But there is something, a unique opportunity when it comes to switching gears into the world of Nezikin, the world of Dine Mamanos, monetary law. Right? The very last Mishnah in Maseches Bava Basra tells us in the name of Rabbi Yishmael that Harotza Sheyachkim Yasok B'Dine Mamanos, that if a person wants to become wise, Harotza Sheyachkim, the way to attain wisdom is specifically by studying this area of Torah. She'in l'chsecha miktsah b'Torah gadol mehen. There's no part of Torah greater than this. He says it compares it to a mayan hanovea. It's like a bubbling fountain, a bubbling spring. There's so much that you can gain from this type of limud. Pashtus in terms of the way we think, the way we analyze, appreciating subtle legal distinctions, nuances, honing our analytical skills. There's a tremendous amount of chachma that can come from Dinei Mamanos. On top of just chachma, wisdom, intellectual knowledge, the Gemara tells us in our Masechta Bava Kama and Daf Lamed that there's additional benefit as well. Haiman debai l'mehave chasida lekayim mile dinezikin. The Gemara says that if a person wants to become a chasid, a pious, righteous person, should study Milei Dinazikin, right? The matters of tort law with Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra, the civil law, monetary law that these Masechtas talk about. Interestingly, the Gemara there cites 2 other areas of Torah that are worthy of study to attain piety, to attain chasidus, either Milei de Avos or Milei de Brachos, or studying the halachos of Brachos, studying Pirkei Avos, but certainly studying Nezikin can bring a person to the state of chasidus, of being a chasid, in the highest sense of the word. And I'll just add that on top of Chachma that the Mishnah said, and on top of Chasidus that the Gemara said, that comes from studying this area of Torah, we also relate perhaps most in this area of Torah to the concept of emes. Obviously, all of Torah is connected to emes. As the Haftorah next week's parsha tells us, Torah's emes, right? Everything in Torah is connecting us to truth. Whether you're studying the laws of brachos, whether you're studying the laws of Shabbos, you're living truth. You're connecting to the reality of the creator of the universe. But there is something just emotionally about and experientially about Seder Nezikin. When you're studying Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Bas, that's all about attaining emes, right? Proof for this, a chazaka for this, eidim for that, trying who's telling the truth, who's not telling the truth, who's the halacha like. It's all focused on emes. And I think in a time like this in particular, where emes is so elusive, where we see the truth can be twisted and contorted in any direction in the society that we live in the time that we live in, maybe that's an additional benefit of studying Seder Nezikin, of bringing more direct emes into the world. And so, by means of introduction, just to be able to understand the basic concepts that come up in Maseches Bava Kama, as well as the following Masechtas, one has to have just a simple understanding of the difference between two types of payment that can come up in halacha. The first type of payment is called mamon, which means compensation, monetary compensation, restoration. This is what we're all familiar with. If you break it, you fix it, right? If I'm playing baseball and I break my neighbor's window with my baseball, it's not a punishment that I have to pay him $100 to have the window fixed. It's not a value judgment that I'm a bad person or I need to atone for it. It just, if you break it, you fix it. It's a basic law of the land. I broke your window, I should pay you for it. If I bump into somebody, as we'll see in the Gemara Bava Kama and Daf Chavav, it also actually came up already a little bit in the Daf Yomi of Adam Muad La'olam, right? That person, if you damage someone else with your body, you're always going to be chayav ben shogeg, ben amazed, whether you meant to do it, whether you didn't mean to do it, ben er, ben yashin, it makes no difference. You always have to pay if you damage someone. Similarly, if you dig a pit in the public thoroughfare, Bar Barushas Harabim, if someone falls in and they sustain $75 worth of damage, you have to pay $75 worth of damage. This is not a punishment. This is just cleaning up the mess that you made. This is similar to what the Gemara says in Daf Yud Maseches Bava Kama, where based on the pasuk Umakya behema yishal mena, the Gemara darshins yashli mena. When you pay for something, it's like you're making it whole. You're restoring it. You're fixing the problem that you caused. If you light a fire and the fire spreads and burns down your neighbor's field, again, you're not a bad guy. We're not accusing you of having done it maliciously, but it's just basic law of the land. Mammon payments. You have to pay to restore that which you ruined. If your ox goes ahead and eats your neighbor's tomatoes, you're going to have to pay. Those are all examples of mammon payments. In stark contrast to a mammon type of payment, right, a compensation, a restoration, a fixing what you did wrong, is something else that the Gemara frequently references, which is called a knas. A knas is a penalty, a punitive fine. Has nothing to do with the actual value of what you destroyed or what you're trying to fix. Rather, it's much more like a slap on the wrist. It's much more there to say, hey, you did something wrong. You need to atone for it. You have to have some sort of a punishment. It's like a parking ticket, right? If you get a parking ticket because you parked in a red zone for $75, see, I'm still in the dollar mode. I have to switch to the 280 shekel for a parking ticket. And we're not saying you caused 280 shekel worth of damage by parking there. You didn't damage anything, but the city didn't want you to do that. And to teach you not to do it again, they're making you pay disconnected to any sort of value, any sort of damage that you may have caused. All right, so everybody get the difference between mammon versus knas. Mammon, you broke something, you're going to pay to fix it. Knas has nothing to do with the value of what you destroyed. You may not have broken anything, but you're going to be paying as a punishment, as an onesh, as a fine, as a parking ticket, in order to attain some level of atonement. Knasos we find many examples of. Perhaps the most well-known, the one that comes up very often, is the knas of kefel. Right? This will be particularly featured in the 7th parak of Maseches Bava Kama, parak Meruba. Kefel is what the Torah tells us in Parashas Mishpatim, that if someone steals an item, certain types of items, most types of items, there are a few exceptions from the rule, but most items, if you steal them, and you're caught, you have to pay not just the value of the item, give back what you took, but you have to pay a double payment for it. So if you stole $100 from someone and you're caught, you now have a knas to pay how much? $200. The first $100 is the mammon payment of you took it, so you give it back. The second $100 on top of the basic Karen payment, the mammon, is the knas, the additional $100 to teach you, don't do this again. This is a punishment, a fine. Now here it's important to specify, not all types of stealing warrant this type of knas. The Gemara makes it very clear, Baba Kama and Ayin Tes, that there are two different types of stealing in halacha. There's something that we call a ganav and something that we call a gazlan. A gazlan is like a mugger, someone who comes up to you with audacity, brazenness, goes right up to you and holds you up and says, give me that. The Gemara quotes the pasuk, Vayigzel asachanis miyad hamitzri. You go and you yank it out of someone's hand, right? You grab their wallet from them and you run off. That's a gazlan. A ganav is someone who's more of a thief. He comes in stealthily, doesn't want to be seen. He breaks into the house when no one's looking and he tries to not get caught and to steal it. Or a pickpocket on the street. Those are ganavim. The difference between a gazlan who's brazen and a ganav who hides and does it secretly. Now, which one of these two has the punishment of kefel? So it's a little bit counterintuitive. I would have thought that the gazlan is worse. He goes and he snatches something out of your hand. That's a terrible, terrible avera. Punish him not just to pay back $100, but make him pay $200. But actually, the halacha is the opposite. The halacha is that the gazlan's punishment is very simple. All he has to do is give back whatever it is that he took. He doesn't get a punishment for mugging you. Fascinating, right? So if he, grabbed $100 out of your hand and he ran away, and now he lost $100, he has to pay you another $100, or has to give you back the $100 if he still has it. That's not.
We seem to have lost Rabbi Wiener. I'm sure he'll get online very soon again. Yes, here he is.
If we don't lose the rabbi at least once a session. No.
Yes.
Only on the first speaker. Oh, no, also the last speaker.
Rabbi Wiener, you're still on the... Okay.
Sorry about that. Good to have a little bit of an intermission. So if the ganav is caught, he just has to give back what he took. There's no punishment for mugging someone, really. You just give back what you took. A ganav, on the other hand, has to pay double. He pays $100 for the 100 that he took, and then another $100 as a knas, as a penalty. Why are we stricter with the ganav than the gazlan? Isn't that somewhat counterintuitive? So it's not my question, it's the Gemara on that daf, the Ayin Tes's question. Why is it that the Torah is so much harder that the ganav has to pay twice? He has a knas, while a gazlan, the mugger, doesn't have any knas. He returns whatever it is that he took, and he's off the hook. So the Gemara says a fascinating idea. That the gazlan is not afraid of God, who told him not to steal, but he's also not afraid of man. He goes right up to him and takes the $100. He takes the watch right out of his hand. On some level, theologically, that's better. That's on a higher level than someone who's a ganav, who he knows God told him don't steal, but he disregards that. But he's still afraid of people. He doesn't want to get caught by people. He's more afraid of people than he is of God. He subordinates his yiras shamayim to his yiras basar v'dam. Right? Remember the Gemara in Brachos tells us that a person, halavai, that our yiras shamayim should be like our yira of bnei adam. But the ganav falls into that mistake, and therefore we punish him with a knas of having to pay double. Other examples of knasos that come up, also in Perek Meruba, is Daled V'Hei. If you steal an ox, and then we said, what's the punishment for stealing the ox when the owner's not looking? You ran off with his ox, you have to pay double. But now if you add insult to injury, and the tavacha or machara, you slaughter it or you sell it, now you're not only going to have to pay double if you're caught, but you're going to have to pay 5 times the value of the ox. And if it's a sheep that you did that to, you're going to have to pay 4 times the value of the sheep. Why should that be? Again, it's a chok. The Gemara in Daf Ayin Tes there gives some suggestions to try to understand why are we stricter with stealing an ox than with stealing a sheep, 4 times versus 5 times the payment. But everybody agrees, it's black and white in the Chumash. There is a knas, a penalty, a parking ticket, a fine for having done this egregious act. Other areas where we find it, ones, mafate, motzi shemra, right? If a person mistreats certain women, right? If a person violates a woman, he seduces a woman, he has to pay 50 silver shkalim as a knas, as a penalty, as a punishment for what he did. If he does motzi shemra, he slanders his wife, accusing her of certain illicit behaviors, he gets even a bigger punishment, 100 silver shkalim. In fact, the Gemara in Erchin and Daf Tes Vav learns from this that the fact that the one who slanders pays more than the one who actually does an action is nimsa ha'omer bepiv chamor min ha'oseh ma'aseh, that on some level words are more damaging than action, right? Words can be so painful, they can leave constant, perpetual stains and harm, that we treat that person even worse. And again, there are many other examples. We're not going to get into every single one of a knas versus mammon. In fact, sometimes it's not clear, is this a knas or is this mammon? In many cases, it's very clear cut. Like you said, you hit the baseball and it smashes the window, that's clearly mammon. If you're paying 4 or 5 times this value of this sheep or this ox, clearly that's a knas, right? The extra payments beyond the base value of the ox. But there are times where the rabbis disagree. Is this a knas or is this mammon? What's an example of that? Very relevant to what the Daf Yomi is doing right now, the concept of palga nizka. Palga nizka. We know that if you own an ox and it gets out and it gores someone, you get 3 passes, so to speak. The first 3 times that it gores, we assume, discussion, how many times exactly? We assume 3 times he is a shor tam, and then after that, he becomes a shor muad, right? And once it's happened 3 times, now you really have to take this very seriously, and we're going to punish you much more strictly, or we're going to have you pay more strictly than if it was the first or second time. So the first 3 times, the halacha is that if it gets out and it gores, how much do you have to pay? Half of the damages. So if you're v'chatzuas kaspa, right, that if you go ahead and the ox gets out and it damages $100 worth of damage, so how much does the owner have to pay? $50. But there's a major machlokes in the Gemara, Bavakama Daf Tes Vav. How do we view palga nizka? What is the nature of this half payment? Everybody agrees that once it's muad and you're paying a full payment, so you damaged $100 and you're paying $100, there everybody agrees that that's mammon. You're paying for what you damaged. It's like the broken window. But the case of the shor tam, those first 3 ones, is an ancient machlokes, major discussion. Is this a knas or is it mammon? One opinion says that it's mammon, right? In theory, you should have had to pay $100 for the damage, the full value. But the Torah just goes easy on you, and it says, because you really didn't see this coming, we'll only charge you $50 for it the first 3 times. But it's a mammon payment. However, another opinion disagrees, and this is how we pass in the halacha, that no, this payment is completely different from the other types of payments. This is a knas when you're paying $50. It's a parking ticket. It's a fine. In other words, really, you shouldn't have had to pay anything here. The idea of your ox getting out and goring is so improbable when it hasn't done it many times that we don't hold you accountable as long as you did, the basic guarding. But if it does happen and you weren't completely a poshea, then we say you have to pay. Then we're going to hold you responsible, and therefore we say that you have to pay chatzi nezek, because you really couldn't have expected it at all. You should have been off the hook entirely, but we're going to slap on a fine on the wrist saying, hey, you should have watched it better the first 3 times. After 3 times, you say it's not a fine anymore. It's just paying what you did, which is the $100. Okay. Given this distinction that there is knas and there is mammon, the parking fine versus just restorative compensation for what you did, are there any differences between them? At the end of the day, what difference does it make? Why do we need to know that there are 2 different types of payment? And so the truth is there are major ramifications lahalacha based on which type of payment we're talking about. And that's why any sugya and bava kama that you're learning, you have to ask yourself the first question, is this a mammon payment or is this a knas payment? What are the differences? So we'll just mention a couple of them. Perhaps the most salient, obvious difference between them is the role of hoda'ah, the role of admission when it comes to these 2 types of payments. we know when it comes to monetary payment, there's a principle called Hoda'as Ba'aldin Kemea Edim Dam, that if I break your window and there's no witnesses around, and I come to Beis Din and I say, I broke the window with my baseball, what's the halacha? Do I have to pay or do I not have to pay? Of course, I have to pay $100 for the $100 window. Your admission obligates you when it comes to the world of Mammon. There's a discussion, the Ketzos is a famous piece on this in Siman Lamed Dalet, exactly how does that work? But everybody agrees, whatever the mechanism is, when you say you did it, of course you have to pay. Why are we going to argue, right? Ki hu zeh, the Torah says, the Gemara learns it from that pasuk, that when you admit to something, you are going to be chayav. However, when it comes to a knas, it's an entirely different halacha. The Gemara learns in Bava Kama and Daf Samach Dalet from the pasuk Asher Yarshiyun Elohim that Yatsa Marshia Esatzmo, that only with a knas you only have to pay the parking ticket if the court sentences you to have to pay it, if the court convicts you of it. But if you go ahead and you preempt and you go to court and you say, I did this, I admit I was wrong, you're totally exempt from the knas payment. Unbelievable chiddush of the Torah. Modeh biknas pater asher yarshiyun Elohim yatsa marshia asatzmo. So this obviously will have very, very significant ramifications, right? That in any time you're dealing with a knas, if the person admits to it, then he doesn't have to pay it. Right? The Gemara has a very interesting case later, Bava Kama and Daf Ayin Dalet, the story of Rabban Gamliel. The Gemara says Rabban Gamliel had a non-Jewish slave, an Eved Kanani, famous Eved Kanani, named Tavi. Right? And the Gemara says that Rabban Gamliel one day was very happy. Why was he happy? Because he came to Rabbi Yoshua and he says, I blinded one of the eyes of my Eved Tavi. Let's assume it was by accident. Why was he happy about that? Because he said the halacha is that if the master of a non-Jewish slave wounds him in certain ways, for example, like blinding him, knocking out his eye, the halacha is that the Eved goes free, that there's a knas. We put a penalty on the master that now you are penalized to have to free this Eved. That's a form of a knas. And so Rabban Gamliel says, great, I'm so happy I can send him free, because normally you're not allowed to free a non-Jewish slave. There's an avera to do that. La'olam behem ta'avodu. But here, Rabban Gamliel says, I found a way to free him. And then the Gemara says, but wait a second, maybe it's not so simple. Because you're telling us that you just did that, that's modeh biknas, and you're pater. We said with a knas, with a parking ticket, with a fine, if you're the one who tells us about it, you're exempt. And so if you're telling us that you wounded your slave and he should be going free, well, guess what? He doesn't go free, because we won't impose the knas because you admitted to it. You owned up to it yourself before anyone else came along. So again, it's a fascinating halacha of modeh biknas pater. Why should this be? Why is it that if you admit to the knas, you don't have to pay it? Right? If I go to City Hall and I tell Aliza Bloch that I parked illegally in the red zone, then even if they afterwards would have found out, I don't have to pay it. Why not? So Rav Elchanan Wasserman explains in the Kovetz Shiurim Chelek Beis and Siman Yud Gimel a very important piece about knasos. He says that the whole idea of a knas, we said, is a penalty. It's a punishment. So you can only, by definition, have a punishment if it's imposed against your will. If witnesses come to court and say, we saw him do that, now he has to pay. We saw him steal that, so he has to pay double. Now the court is forcing me against my will to pay. That's called a punishment. That's a knas. But if I come to court and I say I stole something when he wasn't looking, I'm a ganav, so I really should have had to pay kefil, double payment, but now I don't. I just have to pay the basic payment, $100 of what I stole of $100, because I don't have to pay the extra 100 because I admitted if I'm opting in, you can't have modeh biknas, right? That's not called a punishment. A punishment by definition has to be imposed against a person's will. As I'm saying this, I'm just reminded that there was a fascinating machlokas historically about the concept of smicha, right? Comes up every several hundred years, but certainly about 500 years ago, so 500 to 600 years ago, was a major debate about whether or not to reinstitute the concept of having ordained judges in the fullest sense of the word. Right nowadays, we have smicha. We talk about rabbis having smicha. That's with a lowercase samach. But if you study the Gemara, you see that there was an ancient tradition called smicha with a capital samach, which went all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, that authorized the judges to be able to adjudicate in certain types of cases that they otherwise couldn't do. And as we know, there's a Ma'aribe Rav, there's a whole tumult about whether or not to reinstitute this. We won't get into how that would be done, but is there a way to reinstitute that our judges today should be ordained with the authority of Moshe Rabbeinu so that they would be able to give certain punishments? Why was there interest in this? So there were those from the Spanish Inquisition and Marranos who felt tremendously guilty. They said while they were in Spain, they had to do certain things that might have incurred a punishment of kares, or a divine punishment, for pretending to be not Jewish. And now they wanted to do tshuva. They wanted to repent. And there's a halach, again, we're not going to get into the details, it's a machlokas, but at the end of Maseches Makos, if you get malkos, if the court administers lashes, then you don't get kares. And so they said, wow, this would be a great thing. If we could reinstitute the practice of judges being ordained to be able to give biblical lashes, 39 lashes, okay, it wouldn't be fun. It would hurt for a couple minutes, but then we would be absolved of kares. We would be absolved for all the times in Spain when we pretended to be not Jewish, when we may have done things that weren't appropriate, we may have bowed to idols, whatever it was. And so there's a very, very strong debate. Should we do this? Should we not? One of the factors that was brought, there's an argument against it, is they said, Malkos, the punishment of lashes, only works if you didn't want it and the court is forcing it upon you. But here, where you're asking for Malkos, you're saying, please give me the lashes so I can get atonement and not have kares, maybe that doesn't work. So it's a similar thing here as well. When it comes to a knas has to be a punishment imposed against the person's will. But if he's saying, I did it, I'm guilty, now you've sort of taken away any ability for us to punish you, and therefore we can't give it. It's a fascinating idea. Another area where knas and mammon may differ from each other, a major difference which is important to be aware of as you go through the Masechta, is how is the obligation created? When does the chiyuv kick in? And this is a major machlokes between the achronim. What do I mean? So we know that when it comes to dine mamanos, when it comes to monetary law, the halacha is, the Gemara in Makos and Daf Hey makes this very clear. It depends on how you read the Gemara, but it seems pretty clear from the wording of the Gemara that when it comes to mammon, the compensation payment, that kicks in the moment you do the damage. So again, I'm playing baseball and I hit the ball over the fence into my neighbor's yard and it breaks his window. Even if he's not home, even if no one knows about it, even if the court never told me that I have to pay, at that second that the damage happened, I am halachically obligated to pay him, right? We can't say that, oh, well, nobody found out about it, so I'm off the hook. I'm totally exempt. No. The moment you do it, you're obligated to pay. That's a very basic halacha when it comes to dine mamanos. When it comes to dine nefashos, when it comes to capital punishment, it's exactly the opposite. Let's say a person violates Shabbos, and the court is unable to. Shabbos in the olden times was a capital offense. Again, the Gemara says very clearly, Makos and Daf Zayin, that the court would almost never, ever put somebody to death. This is more of an academic concept than a practical halacha l'maisa, but it's still important to know that in theory, Shabbos is a capital offense. And so let's say a person violated Shabbos, and they were supposed to be chayav misa, but for some technicality, the court couldn't sentence them. So would we tell them they should kill themselves? Would we tell them, okay, well, you violated Shabbos, it's a capital offense, so you're chayav misa. Okay, the court can't enforce it, but you should do it yourself. So of course not. When it comes to dine nefashos, to capital cases, there's no obligation whatsoever until the court actually convicts you. So it's not the action that makes you chayav, that makes you warranting of death. It's specifically the conviction of the court. And if the court can't bang the gavel and sentence you to death for whatever reason, you're absolutely not chayav misa. There's no act of piety for you to go ahead and take your own life to say, well, I'm chayav misa, I better kill myself to get the atonement. No. It's purely from the court. So we have these two opposites. When it comes to mammon, it's clear that whether the court knows about it, whether the court doesn't know about it, you are chayav from the second you did the action. When it comes to dine nefashos, when it comes to capital punishment, everyone agrees you're not chayav at all until the court convicts you. T1, the time of the action, is when dine mamanos kick in. T2, the hamad bedin, the gemara din, the court sentencing you, is when capital punishment kicks in. The question becomes, what about dine knasos? What about a knas, a fine, the penalty? When do you become obligated in that? Is that more like dine mamanos, like mammon, where at the moment that you do the act, you are now ethically, halachically obligated to pay it, even if the court doesn't actually convict you, if the court doesn't find out about it, there are no witnesses, whatever it is, we couldn't nail you in the court, you still have an ethical obligation to pay? Or do we say, no, it's more like dinei nefashos, where the court creates the obligation, where if the court doesn't bang its gavel and say, you have to pay kefil, you have no obligation whatsoever to be paying kefil. We wouldn't tell you, go ahead on your own volition and pay kefil. No, there's no chiyuv whatsoever. Everybody get the two possibilities? Is it like is a knas like dinei mamanos, where you pay right up, where the obligation is right up front, or is it like dinei nefashos, where the obligation kicks in later? Again, there's a lot to talk about here, but I won't get into the Gemara itself there in Makos and Daf Hey that may be a proof text one way or the other. But on that Gemara, Rabbi Kiva Eger at the bottom of the Gemara in the Gilyon Hashas says it's very clear that dinei knasos are the same as dinei nefashos. Dinei nefashos. That just as you need a court to convict, if the court doesn't say you're chayav, you're obligated, you're not obligated at all. There's no chiyuv whatsoever until the court creates the chiyuv. So too by a knas, until the court creates the chiyuv that you have to pay kefil, you have to pay daled vehei, you have to pay 50 shekel kesef. Until you do that, until the court does that, you are completely innocent, and you don't have to pay whatsoever. In other words, by dinei mamanos, the role of the court is to be mevarer the chiyuv. You are obligated, whether we know about it or whether we don't. You have the obligation the moment you do the nezek. You have to pay back what you damaged. But in a knas, we're not paying back what you damaged. You're being punished. You're paying extra. There, it's only if the court sentences you. Otherwise, no. And Rabbi Kiva Eger brings a number of proofs. We don't have time to get into them. But to support this thesis that he says he thinks is nearer that the chiluk is borrowed. He says it's very clear that a knas is more like a death penalty rather than a monetary payment. And Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, in that same piece, in the Kovetz Shiurim, Chelek Beis Siman Yud Gimel, disagrees. He says it's true when it comes to capital cases that until the court bangs its gavel, until it sentences you, you have no chiyuv whatsoever. You're not obligated. Just because you violated Shabbos, just because you killed someone, whatever it is, you're not chayav misa until the court with witnesses proclaims you to be chayav misa. But when it comes to a knas, monetary payment, the fine, that he says is like dinei mamanos. That the moment you did the act, the moment you stole the item, you're going to be chayav kefil, right? The moment you violated that woman, you're going to be chayav the 50 shekel kesef. The moment the ox gores is going to be chayav palga niska. Why? And he brings a very good proof. The sugya that we're going to get to, God willing, in another week or two, Bava Kama Daf Tesvav, a week and a half, where the Gemara says, a fascinating chiddush. The Gemara there says that even if palga niska is kanasa, remember we said it's a bachlokas, but even if we assume that the half payment that you have to make for a shor tam, or your ox gores the first 3 times, you only pay half, we said, and that is a fnas. You shouldn't have been paying anything, but we're going to add on as a punishment to pay half to teach you to be a little bit more careful. Once he gores 3 times, now you're going to have to pay the full amount every time. But for the first 3 times, you have that knas, that payment. The Gemara says an unbelievable chiddush that let's say we can't convict you. Let's say you're outside of Eretz Yisrael, where they don't do dinei knasos. The court isn't authorized because they don't have the right type of judges to do it. The Gemara says tfisa still works. What's tfisa? Again, it's a concept that will come up a number of times throughout the Masechtos. Tfisa means that in some instances, if I'm owed something by someone, I'm allowed to go and grab it from them. What? Isn't that robbery? Isn't that theft? No, he owes it to me. So if the court isn't going to make him pay for some reason, Avid inish dina lanafshi, I'm allowed to sometimes go ahead and take the item for myself. This again, daf kavches in Masechtas Bava Kama. And so, if tfisa sometimes works, let's say somebody borrowed money from me, and they owe me $100, and they're not paying me back, and the court isn't going to do anything for whatever reason, or we can't get to court, I'm allowed to go and take from him his $100 watch. What are you doing? You're taking it? Yeah, it's mine. He owes it to me. I'm allowed to do that in certain situations. It's tfisa. And so the Gemara says that just like tfisa could work when it comes to dinei mamanos, if somebody owes you money, so too the Gemara says it could work for dinei knasos. That for a knas, if somebody owes you a knas, but they weren't sentenced by the court to have to pay it, the Gemara seems to say you're allowed to go and break into their house and take it from them. You should snatch it from them because they owe it to you. So Rabbi Chanan Wasserman says, isn't that a clear proof that even though the court never sentenced you to have to pay the knas, you still have some sort of chiyuv? There still is some sort of obligation, some sort of halachic ethical obligation for you to pay the man this money, this chatzi nezek, Because if there was no obligation until the court bangs its gavel, well, then if the court didn't bang its gavel, how can I go in and snatch it for myself? I'm snatching something I'm not entitled to. It must be, he says, that the moment the damage happens by your ox, you owe half of the payment. You owe half damages right then. Okay, once the court comes and bangs its gavel, now we know for sure. But there is a halachic obligation even before the Gemara din. That's the great proof, Rabbi Chanan, among other proofs that we don't have time to get into, brings to show that a knas applies. There is a chiyuv even from the moment of the nezek. It's just that okay, we need a hamada bedin in order to force you to do it. But if the one who is owed the money wants to go ahead and snatch it for himself, he's allowed to, because technically you do still owe it to him. Isn't that a great proof? So what would Rabbi Akiva Eger counter to that? Rabbi Akiva Eger clearly knew the Gemara. So again, there are Rishonim who understand that Gemara in a much more limited sense. We say that no, from a knas, chas v'shalom, we would tell you that you're allowed to snatch a knas from someone when they don't actually owe you, and the court didn't sentence them. They don't owe you anything until the court sentences. If they don't owe you anything, how are you allowed to snatch? You can't. Okay, maybe they say it was a rabbinic enactment. This was a takana midrabanan. If they look at the Rosh there, the Ravid and others, they try to explain this Gemara in a more exceptional, unique, limited sort of way to say that it doesn't prove that there's an absolute obligation for a knas the moment you do the damage. Rather, knas is like mammon, and that rather knas is like din nefashos, where there's no chiyuv whatsoever. So just to summarize what we saw this morning, we made a little bit of an introduction into Maseches Bava Kama, looking at these two different types of payments that will come up over and over and over again throughout this Masechta and other Masechtas as well. One type of payment we said is called mammon, which is monetary compensation. It's not a punishment. It's not a fine. It's just yashli mena, fix what you broke. The other type of payment we said is not mammon. It's a knas. It's a punitive fine. It's not fixing what you broke. It's slapping you on the wrist. It's teaching you shouldn't. This is a punishment, the form of a kapara, if you will, and you have to pay that. We said, what difference does it make? Either way, you're paying money. Why do we care if it's called mammon? Why do we care if it's called knas? So we saw two basic distinctions, which actually may be connected to each other. The first distinction we saw is mode biknas pater, that when it comes to a knas, if you admit that you did it wrong, you don't have to pay. If you come first to Beis Din and you say, I did it, it was my fault, then you don't have to pay. But by mammon, if you come and say, I broke his window, of course you're going to have to pay. You're obligating yourself to pay. That was one major distinction. And the second distinction we saw is at what point does the obligation begin? When you're talking about a mammon obligation, the obligation kicks in from Shamayim right away. Whether we know about it, whether we don't, if you know about it, that you did it, you have to pay him. You owe him the money from that second that the window was broken. But we said when it comes to a knas, if my shor tam gores somebody else's ox, then it's not so simple. When do I become obligated? Rabbi Chanan Wasserman said, just like by mammon, you become obligated. The moment the goring happens, you have to pay. Okay, even if the court doesn't know about it, even if no one else knows about it, you have an obligation to pay, just like any other monetary payment. But Rabbi Akiva Eger and Makos and Dafei said no, that with a knas, the court creates the obligation. If the court doesn't sentence you, if it didn't get to court yet, you're not at all obligated whatsoever. And we saw one nafkamina, ramification of that debate could be, are you allowed to do tfisa? Are you allowed to seize the item? If the court didn't sentence him to pay, is the victim allowed to go ahead and say, I'm going to take it for myself anyway? If there is a theoretical obligation at that point, then he is allowed to snatch it. If there's no theoretical obligation until the court says you have to pay, then you're taking money that's not yours. You're not entitled to it. There'd be no value to doing that. Just like we said, a person who's chayav misa, there's no value to him killing himself if the court doesn't actually sentence. I just wanted to conclude very briefly that this discussion of mode biknas pater, that we say if you admit that your ox gored somebody else's ox, and now you don't have to pay because mode biknas pater. A number of the Achronim, particularly in the Kabbalistic line of thought, it's brought in the name of the Arizal and others as well, say that the idea of mode biknas pater is what underlies the foundation of all of tshuva. All of tshuva, all of the vidui that we do on Yom Kippur, all the times we say the things that we did wrong. Why does that help? Why does that work? They say it's midin mode biknas pater, that Hashem appreciates, Hashem values. If we come forward and we acknowledge our mistakes, we acknowledge our shortcomings, we acknowledge the truth of what happened, that is the foundation of tshuva. And then we're exempt, right? If we're mode biknas pater, if I say Hashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, we're being mode biknas, and therefore that is the secret of how tshuva works. Based on this very technical, monetary sugya, is the foundation of everything we're doing on Yom Kippur. And I think this is such a powerful message to think about. We know that there's nothing more valuable to Hashem, or almost nothing more valuable than emes. Right? The Gemara says in Sanhedrin of Samech Dalet that chosmo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu emes, the seal of Hashem is truth. And if you look at the very first sin in the Torah, very first human sin, right, of Adam Harishon, Adam and Chava eating from the Eitz Hadas, what was the biggest problem? If you read the Psukim carefully, it wasn't necessarily that they ate from the Eitz Hadas. That was bad. But what was really bad was the denial. It was the shifting of the blame. It was trying to hide behind the bushes, literally and figuratively, to try to cover up a little bit from just acknowledging I did something wrong. And the reason why that story is put right at the beginning of the Torah, or the reason why it's the foundation of everything else that comes in the Torah, is because the entire purpose of this world, the whole reason HaKadosh Baruch Hu made you and me, what does he have a need for us to be here? It's the whole point is for us to get it wrong, to mess up terribly, but to acknowledge it, to learn from it, and to move forward. The Gemara has the phrase, Lo nitna Torah limlache hasharis. The Torah wasn't given to angels. The whole point is that we're expected to be messing up. We're expected to get it wrong a lot of the time. But the most important thing is to be modeh biknas, to acknowledge. So you messed up. Great. So do I all the time. But don't hide from it. Don't go behind the bushes. Don't try to blame it to the fact it wasn't really me. It was Chava. It was the Nachash. It was something else. It wasn't. Just stand up. Take the responsibility. And in fact, don't just take the responsibility. Cherish the opportunity to have the responsibility. I remember once hearing about a world champion bodybuilder. And, he'd won all sorts of awards and he was considered, the greatest. And they asked him, they said, what was your secret? Like, how did you get to this level of being so powerful, so good? And he said something very interesting that stuck with me for many years. He said, it's very simple. All of my competitors were terrified of someone pointing out anything they were doing wrong, any sort of weakness, anything that wasn't good. They tried to cover it up. They tried to hide. They would get angry and defensive if you pointed out something. So I was the opposite. I loved it. I cherished. If somebody could show me something I was doing wrong, that was an opportunity to go after it and to fix it and to improve it. And that's how I became the greatest. That's how I became the champion. And that's true for all of us, right? That the more we try to sweep things under the rug, to not be receptive to suggestions, to critiques, to not be modeh when we mess up, when we do something wrong, then we live a false life. We live in these false perfectionistic palaces that we give ourselves the illusion, the delusion that we're living in. But if we can embrace it, if we can say, okay, I'm going to modeh biknas, I'm going to do it, that's the foundation of all of tshuva, and that's the foundation of all of life. And I'll just conclude just from where we started, that I think this is particularly important in our times. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this is a time where emes, where truth is being so distorted in ways perhaps never in world history, just because there's so many, the human instinct is the same, but the technology, the ability to spread things, to spread falsehoods, the artificial intelligence to create false images, I mean, everything now can be twisted and distorted. And in fact, the Gemara tells us, the Mishnah, the Masechah Sota, Daf Mem Tes Amud Beis, the very last daf of Sota, that the ikva de Mashiach, the ikvos Mashiach, in the time when Mashiach is going to come, there's going to be all sorts of bad things or difficult challenges that happen. And one of the things the Mishnah says, V'ha'emes tehei ne'ederes. Truth will be lost, right? Truth will be rare. Truth will be hard to find, right? The truth is going to be distorted. We're told this thousands of years ago that this is what's going to happen as we get closer and closer to Mashiach. Truth is going to become more and more rare. And so we see again how barbarians can be portrayed as lovable teddy bears, that they can be portrayed as victims, they can be portrayed as people we want to ally with and who are being wronged. You see how anything now can be twisted and spun and portrayed in a way to create your own truth. And so halavai, as we embark on a Seder Nezikin, Maseches Bava Kama, the Maseches, as we said, the Seder of emes, which is all about finding truth. And the Eidim and the Hachasha, the Hazam, everything is about how do we find truth. Halavai, that our learning, and even more than our learning, our living and our acting should bring truth into the world to help everyone recognize the truth of Hashem Echad, Shmo Echad, that we should see shalom and peace, harmony, happiness for all of us speedily in our time.
Amen. Thank you so much, Rabbi Weiner, for a clear and very important introduction to Masechet Bava Kama. Anyone who learned Masechet Bava Kama knows how important this introduction is, and anyone who's didn't but is going to will figure out, will learn how important it is. And thank you for tying it into literally the meaning of life and the fabric of our being, and having such a contemporary message for our times. The idea of tshuva and truth, tying that into the idea of knas, moda b'knas. Thank you very much. And may today's learning be Leilui Nishmat Aya Shlomo ben Mark and Debbie Searing and Amir Meir ben Avam V'chaya Esther Skuri, both connected to our community, both heroes, soldiers who were killed 30 days ago on Simchat Torah. Today is their Shloshim. May they have an Ilui Neshama, Hashem Yinkom et Damam, and may we all be zoche for days of peace, and may the Shvuim come back. May we have refuah shlema for all the ptsuim, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Should hear Besaras Tovos.
Amen. So we are going to reconvene in a few minutes, in 10 minutes exactly at 11 o'clock. Thank you.